Atmospheric Sciences Department, and it was a real honor and privilege for the faculty in our department to nominate one of our colleagues, Cecilia Bitz, to be here this evening. And Cecilia received her Bachelor of Science from Oregon State in engineering physics, and then her master's in physics from the University of Washington in physics, and then her PhD in atmospheric sciences. And there's a number of us who are on the faculty here in the department that also went to the University of Washington, and several overlapped with Cecilia. I kind of predated them a little bit. So. She is currently a professor in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and also director of the program on climate change. Her research over the years has been supported by, the complete alphabet soup of all the funding agencies: National Science Foundation, NASA, NOAA, Office of Naval Research, and has led to well over 100 publications on a number of topics, of course, centering on issues in the Arctic and polar regions. She has been recognized in a number of ways over the years. She's a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, and as well as a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, which are kind of the two professional organizations closest in our field. And she also received the Rosenthal Award in atmospheric science and oceanography for her significant contributions to understanding the role of polar regions to the climate system. So Dr. Bitz has also been involved in numerous professional and public outreach activities, just talking about Arctic and polar issues. She's served on the National Research Council Board of Atmospheric Sciences, which is part of the National Academy, is a very prestigious way to be able to influence sort of the direction of our field. And she's also testified about the Arctic before the U.S. Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And I was asking her for one little snippet of things today as far as, what I can do as far as introducing. She said, well, one of the things was when she was testifying in front of the U.S. Senate with Al Franken there and Bernie Sanders there, that apparently you started laughing in the middle of your presentation. Was it just the irony of being there? Okay, so it's really a privilege and if everyone can help welcome her here, Professor Cecilia Bitz.
Thank you very much for that very warm introduction, and I'm really thrilled to be here. Let me just start this. All right, so the topic I'm going to speak about today is about how snow and ice are changing in the polar regions. And many of you may have heard that the Arctic climate has been changing rapidly, while the Antarctic climate is kind of a mixed bag. And I want to try to explain why that is. Many of us have a real strong feeling of connection to ice and snow regions. Probably many of you, especially because you live in Utah, and I, of course, live in Washington State, where we also have pretty spectacular mountains. So ice and snow is really important to us. It influences our climate. It holds fresh water that in reserve for us and for our use, and in turn, that fresh water can also influence the ocean circulation in these really remote environments in important ways that I'll try to talk about today. I want to start by trying to give you a real sense of what it's like in the polar regions and why they're important to climate. And then I'll transition to how the climate has been changing and how it will likely change in the future. This is a picture of Arctic sea ice and snow on land, and Greenland off in one corner. Let me get my pointer. And the little statement that ice keeps our planet cool because it's so reflecting. Sea ice is also important because it insulates the ocean from the atmosphere from the ocean, and so it allows the atmosphere to be much colder than it would otherwise be. As we'll see, it's also important in terms of many feedbacks on the climate system that influence the coupled response to change. Sea ice is distinct from icebergs. They're both floating on the ocean, but sea ice is frozen seawater, so it has salt incorporated in it, whereas icebergs are the land ice that is accumulated from snow, and it's fresh. The icebergs are generally a lot thicker, and they stick up higher as a result. So here they're really obvious, but sometimes they're not quite as dramatic. Sea ice is about as thick as a person is tall, though it's changed a lot. In the Arctic, it used to be more like the height of a house, and now it's quite a bit smaller than that. It seasonally varies a lot, so it's hard to just give you a single number. Antarctica is really known for its very large volume of of land ice on the continent, reaching the peak at roughly the South Pole of many thousands of meters deep. And this picture just shows the creep associated with the thickness being so great, and the sloping down towards the coastline causes it to creep towards the coastline. And there are a couple of giant shelves that are floating on the ocean, and they're still attached to the continent, so they're not yet icebergs, but they become icebergs. And then a number of smaller shelves surrounding it, and they play an important role in the story I'm going to tell tonight. These are buttressing the ice, a so-called term that kind of reminds us a little bit of the flying buttresses on big churches of the past. They hold the ice from flowing as fast as it would otherwise towards the ocean. So when we lose the thickness or entirely as they melt away, we should expect the flow rates of the ice to accelerate towards the ocean, and so it'll ultimately cause the land ice to increase its flow towards the ocean. So they have a connection. I have a number of animations to show you to help you really picture this environment. This is zooming in towards Antarctica. This is visible imagery, so it has clouds that obscure until, with some graphical enhancement, we can see through the clouds at times. And their sea ice is shown moving, whereas most of the shelves are fixed, and then some of the sea ice is also fixed. There's some what's known as land-fast sea ice. We're flying around to the east now by starting at McMurdo Sound and then going towards the Antarctic Peninsula here. These are some of the really famous glaciers that are shown there. Pine Island Glacier has had a lot of press lately. And then we're going to zoom in on the peninsula here to Larsen B, which in 2012 disintegrated in a matter of a few months. And I was a professional scientist at that time. I'd already graduated, and I remember when we first started seeing the signs of it disintegrating, it was a really profound experience because it hadn't happened before our eyes like that in satellite imagery. You're seeing sea ice around the continent here shimmering as it's very dynamic. It's moving with the circulation because it's thin and it's not continuous, so it can float and flow. So that's the end. Next animation is of the Arctic, and Greenland is a much smaller volume of ice land ice than Antarctica by about a factor of 7 or so. And it's zooming into one of the outlet glaciers of Greenland, and it's not nearly the same kind of drama as you see in these large ice shelves. This is known as a Tidewater Glacier, and yet there are something like 12 of them around Greenland, and they are the major export mechanisms for ice flow off of the continent. And you can see the flow accelerates as it goes towards the water, and then it it's continuous ice here, and then becomes broken up into pieces and floating here. And now it's going to show you the change in that line, that transition line between the continuous floating ice and the iceberg tongue, which is very well observed from space for about the last 40 years. And just in the last decade and a half or so, you can see it's marching towards the main ice sheet here. And we have some proxy data from before the satellite era where we can estimate the location of the edge between the icebergs and the floating ice tongue, and you can see how much it accelerated. I'm not going to continue with these just because I only have a limited amount of time. This is the last animation, and this is an aircraft image. It's a video that was taken during Project Icebridge in 2007, and this is sea ice. This is really my main focus in my research, but I'll talk to you about both land ice and sea ice today. This is really showing the small flows that are near the ocean open water, and they result from a lot of wave action that waves actually propagate into sea ice to some 100 kilometers or so and break it and fracture it into these pieces. This is more interior to the edge where it's more continuous, and you're seeing these are pressure ridges and pretty heavy snow cover there, and then just a more horizontal view of the same. And that's the end of the videos. So I want to talk next a little bit about how sea ice and land ice connect to the ocean circulation. This is an image of the global ocean overturning circulation, and it is noteworthy that it's darkest blue where it's sinking, and then darkest blue also where it's circulating at depth, and red where it's circulating nearer to the surface. So this ribbon of red in the Atlantic Ocean is transporting warmer water at the surface. It's warmed partly because it's at the surface and absorbing sunlight all as it passes across the equator and up into the northern North Atlantic, and then it sinks in the presence of ice and snow, right at the ice edge, where sea ice, as it grows, it rejects salt and it helps add salt and densify the water. But it's this precarious location where also there's a lot of meltwater. And so the meltwater, when it adds to the ocean, lightens the water and promotes stabilizing the water, so it inhibits sinking. So you're at this really delicate location for creating dense water that can sink. And it can be influenced strongly by the changes in climate. There's also sinking in a couple of major locations around Antarctica, which are right next to those large ice shelves. And that is the other major location. So both places, right at the presence of ice and sea ice, land ice and sea ice. This is a slice that's looking at depth and latitude. So it's as if you were looking into this side throughout the world ocean. So it's taken away the continents so you can see right through them. And it's an average of the overturning circulation. And what it looks like is two cells, an upper cell that is associated with this ribbon that goes to the north in the North Atlantic, and the sinking right at the sea ice edge and near Greenland in the north, where it sinks down to about half of the depth of the ocean. And then it transports southward and rises up in the Southern Ocean. So it's surprising that this water, even though it's coming from below, it's slightly warmer than the water at the surface because it had been warmed all along its path to the north. So we have a source of warmer water that's upwelled from below in the Antarctic. And then the very deepest water sinks right at the Antarctic continent, where it's losing heat to the atmosphere and gaining some salt from sea ice production. So a very strong connection between sea ice and the ocean. This is a figure that just zooms into the Atlantic to really help show that the location of where the sinking is right along the sea ice edge and along Greenland. Also shows you some of the names that you may be familiar with, like the Gulf Stream, that's part of this circulation. And it really just changes its name when it branches into the Norwegian Sea, or Nordic Seas, and becomes known as the North Atlantic Drift. The Southern Ocean is a fair bit more complicated. I think partly that's because it's a continent surrounded by ocean, and the ocean experiences very, very heavy winds. Without any land to obstruct the winds, they're just roaring in the Southern Ocean. And that makes for a very dynamic connection between the atmosphere and the ice and the ocean there. The westerly winds are pervasive in both hemispheres, but they're very strong here. And they drive a lot of mixing in the ocean and a circulation to the north. So it's a funny thing that occurs when you blow on the ocean. Transport is either to the right or to the left. It's to the left in the southern hemisphere. And so you see the circulation at the surface going towards the equator. And then this upwelling that I mentioned was part of the Atlantic circulation primarily, bringing up some warmish water just slightly above freezing, but that is warmer than what the surface would otherwise be. So we have places in the Southern Ocean of heat released by the ocean, and it's also warming a heat source to the sea ice, keeping it from growing thicker than it would otherwise. You also may note that it gets pretty close to the ice shelf, and I'll come back to that in more clear-cut figures in the future here. But I also just wanted to show a picture of the climatological sea surface temperature. And this is the annual average. So both hemispheres are kind of treated fairly here. And what you see is that the Antarctic is just a lot colder. It's a much colder, for the same latitude, I think this is 55 degrees south and north, it's 3 degrees Celsius versus 7. So considerably colder, and that's because of those heavy winds. It's not for any other reason for solar radiation. It's just purely the wind-driven circulation that keeps this circulation in the ocean very, bringing water to the north, as I mentioned earlier. So it is constantly cooling the surface through that overturning circulation in the ocean and the strong winds. And therefore, we have a lot further sea ice further equatorward in the Antarctic. So I just want to review the basic scene I've set, which is that we have sea ice and land ice creating really highly reflective surfaces that reflect sunlight back to space and keep our planet cooler than it otherwise would be. And sea ice insulates the atmosphere from the ocean, also allowing the atmosphere to be cooler than it otherwise would be. Melting land ice actually is a source of sea level rise, which I just wanted to state because it is an important part of the rest of the story here today that is unique from sea ice. Sea ice is already floating in the ocean, so it doesn't actually cause any sea level to change when it melts. Neither do ice shelves. But when ice is on land and it melts, it adds water to the ocean. So I want to look out for that as an important connection. And then the growth and melt of sea ice because of the removal of fresh water and the rejection of salt has a role in ocean circulation that I described. Now I want to talk about the changes that we've seen. And I'll start just with a map of the trends in temperature at every point over the last 60 years or so. And this picture shows a pattern that is very remarkable, with strong warming amplified in the Arctic and not so much in the Antarctic. And this is where I think a lot of people want to understand that, because if we think ice and snow promote warming by amplifying through the loss of reflectivity when they melt, wouldn't you expect that to be the case in the Antarctic as well? And I'll try to explain that, but it's very clear in the Arctic where there's land ice and snow on land and sea ice, we see this amplified warming over the last 60 years. If we look at a shorter period of time, just the last 36 years or so, we still see this Arctic amplification, but we see some really big differences in the global pattern, right? Especially in the tropics. That actually was cooling over the last 36 years in the eastern tropical Pacific, and cooling throughout a lot of the Southern Ocean, and warming over the peninsula and some parts, some very patchy structures, right? Really complicated. That merits a lot of explanation, I think. But it does suggest maybe a connection with the tropics that I want to try to explain. So first I want to explain a little bit about how we do our research. Mainly we use satellite imagery for observations of sea ice and land ice to get the full picture, but we often have to go and make local measurements to validate the satellites. But this is a MODIS image just to give you a sense of what we actually really can do from space. We can actually, though, see resolution down to a meter or so, maybe even less. Though that's actually an overwhelming amount of data, and generally we don't need it down to that resolution. Depends on what we're doing. But here, this is to show you how broken up the sea ice is over really large length scales. So there's a lot of open water interspersed with the sea ice, and allowing sunlight to be absorbed in between big chunks that are known as flows. So when we actually calculate the total sea ice extent, we take averages over the pixel size of one instrument, which is known as a passive microwave, everywhere where the sea ice concentration is above 15%, and add it up over the whole hemisphere, and that's what gives us the sea ice area. And we've been able to observe that for over 40 years with great accuracy. This is the annual mean, so all months of the year averaged in each data point, and for each hemisphere separately. Of course, it's really remarkable that you see a tremendous decline in the Arctic sea ice, and what might even look like an increase in the Antarctic until the last 3 years, when a remarkable crash occurred, and that's an area of active research that many of us are working on. We have lots of other evidence of sea ice and land ice change. I really like this image because partly because it's colorful, but also it's just totally independent. It's a different satellite, a different instrument on the satellite. It's measuring scattering from the undulations, the roughness of the surface. And older sea ice is rougher. So as it's survived a couple of melt seasons, it gets rough, like snow would in the mountains here, right? When it's fresh, it's more flat and uniform. And we can see that from space quite easily using this scatterometer instrument. So what it's showing us is dark bluish colors where the ice is young, less than a year since the January, each of these is taken in January, and red where it's over a year old or so. So this picture really shows how much we've transitioned from ice in the Arctic in January, when it's still ice covered in winter, throughout the whole season, the whole record. We've transitioned from a fair amount of multi-year ice to very little and predominantly covered in first-year ice. So sea ice is really important for a lot of reasons, but one is it transports fresh water where it grows and where it melts. And when it's thinner, as it is now, it has, in the Arctic, increased the speed at which it's transported. So we're seeing an acceleration in the transport from one region to the next, and the amount of freshening that occurs in one region versus the amount of salt rejected in another, and those influence the ocean. It's basically, the idea is just it's more mobile when it's thinner and more broken up. So before 2000, we see this thick ice and highly concentrated ice. It didn't move very fast. The transport was quite slow, whereas now it's about doubled, or maybe 50% increase in the rate it's transported away from the coast. And that's kind of a late winter perspective, but what about in summer when we start really seeing open water appear and persist because it doesn't regrow when it opens? And when it opens earlier in the year, as it does in the later decades, that allows more sunlight to be absorbed, and that further warms the ocean and promotes more melting. So that's an amplifying effect on climate change. It also is a stronger, surface warming, but it actually adds to warming aloft, and that's something that's become very, very highly appreciated more in recent years, and that how it changes the whole atmospheric structure with the presence of sea ice is very important for climate. I want to talk about sea level rise briefly now too. Sea ice, as I mentioned, doesn't contribute to sea level rise, but land ice does. And in the past, the rate of sea level rise has been dominated by what's called thermospheric components. So just thermal expansion of the ocean primarily. So the warming of the ocean itself, water expands when it gets warmer. That's about half of the total. And the next biggest component is from runoff from mountain glaciers and small ice caps. But we are really running out of that contribution. And what's overcoming it now, I guess actually Greenland is already in this estimate slightly higher. But you can see Greenland is bigger and Antarctica is the last component. But if we look at the acceleration, things really change. And it's the two land ice components that are accelerating. So we actually expect them to overwhelm the situation in the future and dominate the control on sea level rise, which is one of the reasons why I think many people pay a lot of attention to what's happening at the poles. And when sea ice retreats, it amplifies the warming, which further causes land ice to melt. So they're highly connected. We have very good evidence of these measurements in the last few decades through a couple of different instruments. One is a gravity-based measurement. It actually measures gravitational anomalies. And when ice melts, it has lower gravity at the surface, and we can see that from space. And the second instrument is basically just looking at the height or elevation of the sea surface, and it's an altimetry-based instrument. So two independent, this is just used for ice, and this is used for both ice and ocean. So we have other, these excellent measurements. In fact, we can use the gravitational measurements to break down the Antarctic continent into three regions: a west, an east, and peninsula region. And I'll show you what these are in space in a minute, but just I mainly wanted to show the total actually in this, to show you what the acceleration really looks like. And we think we were in roughly mass balance, which would amount no change on average year to year prior to about 1990. But now in Antarctica, I guess that estimate was averaging over something like this period, where it was giving us only a fraction of a millimeter a year, and now we're getting close to a sea level contribution that's much, much accelerated. So these are records that we have very good data from GRACE, and they're showing us pretty alarming evidence of change. So I want to talk about the potential for change driven by ocean circulation and its interaction with ice on land and shelves. I mentioned there's upwelling of warm water in the Southern Ocean, and I didn't really get too detailed about how it interacted with the ice shelves, but off the coasts, I mentioned there's this water. It's known as circumpolar deep water that upwells in the Southern Ocean, and some fraction of it can be upwelled over the continental shelf and under the ice shelves into the so-called ice shelf cavity region. And if it does, it can promote melting at the base of the shelf. This is natural. It's been happening as long as we know. But if there's a mechanism to drive this in further, we would expect an increase in the melt rate. And in fact, there's good evidence that that has been occurring. We have seen the height of these ice shelves thinning, and we have actually put instruments under ice shelves now, though we didn't have much in the past to compare with, but the best estimates are showing changes in the geometry of these cavities, where you see they tend to build up a little bump when they're grounded at one place for a long period of time, because this ice is shoving debris along as it moves and flows towards the grounding line. But when it starts to melt back rapidly, you start to see different shapes appear, like this little bump starts to give way to a depression behind it. And it turns out whenever the ice is grounded at a point where it slopes backwards away from the ocean, that's a condition that's unstable. So once we've gotten over a bump like this, which is kind of self-preserving, when ice is stable for a long period of time, it can accelerate. I want to emphasize, though, this instability, while it's serious and likely there's a good chance that we've already reached a point where the western side of Antarctica has gone into an unstable situation. The loss of West Antarctica isn't expected to occur rapidly. It's likely to take about 1,000 years. But it is considered to be unstoppable once it reaches this instability. And to show you what a map of the location of the bed underneath the ice in the western, so this is the western half of Antarctica, looks like. It's well below sea level in some places, up to a couple thousand meters. So that suggests that once we start melting backwards, we have a lot of ocean to be exposed, as the ice was already it was grounded below sea level to begin with, right? So this is when people talk about West Antarctic ice sheet being unstable, it's because it's grounded below sea level. East Antarctica is not to any great extent, and so it's much more stable, thank goodness, because it's a very big mass of ice. The last evidence of melt of ice sheets I'll show is this one, which is the elevation changes that we have measured over the last decade or so. And what they're showing is in meters per year, values of 5 to 10 meters, or about 5 meters, I guess, to 7 meters maximum. And that maximum has occurred primarily in the Amundsen Sea, and the Pine Island Glacier is right here. I mentioned that earlier as a kind of landmark, because it has changed dramatically and is one that we are keeping an eye on. The very big ice shelves are much slower, and thank goodness, because they are holding back such a large mass of ice that it would be, and they're very big, fortunately. So these are changing much more slowly. So the overall change, though, is up to about a fifth of the thickness of these smaller ice shelves. And associated with this increased melt that we've observed, there is an increased freshening of the seawater around Antarctica. But one of the last points I'll make about the change is this really remarkable result, that actually where the sea level rise you expect from the loss of a continental ice sheet like West Antarctica is, strangely enough, not near Antarctica. Because the ice sheet itself attracts things to it. It's a gravitational attraction source. So when you lose the ice, it actually lets the sea relax because it's not being attracted upward anymore. So we actually get sea level to relax and drop a little bit if we remove all of the West Antarctic ice sheet in these estimates of sea level. And instead, where it accumulates most is around the US. So even though, yeah, it's not good news, right? This is just a relative value. So 1 would be you're getting the average, and I think the sea level loss amount we would expect is about 3.5 meters or so from West Antarctica. So you can just multiply, we would get around 5 meters. So bear in mind, though, this is a very long time frame, right? We're talking about 1,000 years. So it's unfortunate, but it's not going to change. Well, the change is fairly slow. So just to review that, we see globally a pattern of strong warming in the Arctic and mixed, complicated warming over the last 60 years in the Antarctic. Complementary to that, sea ice has been decreasing dramatically in the Arctic, not so much in the Antarctic until very dramatic changes in the last 3 years. And then the Antarctic ice sheets are losing mass and largely driven through upwelling of heat from below. And so despite the fact that we don't see much warming at the surface here, there's this undersurface warming that's been occurring that actually has this consequence of freshening the ocean surrounding it and thereby stabilizing the ocean and kind of inhibiting the warm water from reaching the actual surface there and trapping it more below right at the base of the ice shelves and actually not helping the ice shelves one bit. So I'll try to show that in a little bit more as I talk a little bit about what we might anticipate for sort of at first some explanations and then future. So I kind of made the case that the ice and ocean are really strongly connected, and I want to show just one map of what that looks like in terms of data. And these are trends in the sea surface temperature and the sea ice around Antarctica. And they really show a complementary pattern, don't they? Where we've seen a ringing of cooling around Antarctica with a small amount of warming right along the peninsula, the Amundsen Sea, where the Pine Island Glacier is, and some of these other glaciers that have gotten a lot of news. And that's exactly where the sea ice has been decreasing, whereas elsewhere it has been increasing. So strong connection between the ocean and the ice. No surprise, right? The ice is floating in the ocean. And then plenty of warming occurring outside of the ring around the Southern Ocean. So why would that be exactly? I think I've alluded to it a little bit. But first, just geometrically, these are two very different regions, despite the fact that they both have ice and snow. One is an ocean surrounded by land, and the other is, a continent surrounded by ocean. So that should be a hint there. The connection between the ocean circulation is different too. The main branch of circulation from the meridional overturning, or the large-scale overturning circulation, is in the Arctic through the Atlantic region here and into the Nordic seas. And the bathymetry is such that it's pretty shallow right here, but as soon as you get into the ocean, into the Arctic Ocean, it's deep enough, and this water is very saline, so it sinks. And once it gets into the Arctic, it doesn't really influence the sea ice so much. So it has been likely contributing to loss of sea ice in this region, but fortunately, it isn't contributing overall to loss throughout the rest of the Arctic. In contrast, the Antarctic had this northward drift associated with the very strong westerly winds, right? Westerly winds dominate, just gigantic, uninhibited by land, and then the leftward circulation in the ocean associated with that might actually be promoting some sea ice to expand, but more importantly, I think it's the ocean it's drawing cold water north. Just to give you now a kind of cartoon cross-section of that inflow from the Atlantic, it's nice and warm. And now we add, say, the effects of global warming from CO2 to it. That would be warming this water, but look, it sinks. It never really makes it too far into the Arctic. So it has a tremendous effect on warming the subpolar seas and adding to the warmth in the subpolar seas because it's picking up this additional warming through the effect of global warming. But it kind of peters out. Whereas in the Antarctic, we have this other really interesting effect, which is this slow overturning circulation. Remember, it took probably a couple hundred years from the last time this water was at the surface to reach this point, because it's such a slow circulation. So this water hasn't really warmed at all from global warming at depth. It's just not happened yet. It will in maybe a century or two. And it's upwelling. It's bringing up its climatological heat, which is a few tenths of a degree above freezing. And it, then argued has been moving towards Antarctica, wreaking some havoc there. Also keeps the sea ice a little thinner than it otherwise would be. But it's not changing much from global warming yet. And so in a sense, it's acting as a buffer. It's inhibiting the effects of global warming compared to the subpolar Arctic. So it's kind of just replacing, right? Whenever we add warming at the surface, we sweep it to the north. So what action there is probably not driven directly through heat, like it is in the Arctic, in the subpolar seas, because it's being swept away. Instead, what's more likely is these westerly winds are changing, and if they do change, we would expect an increase in this flow to the north, which actually causes more flow away from the continent. So I'm going to try to get to that in pictures, but I've kind of gotten a little bit ahead of myself. Why would we expect the westerlies to change? Well, greenhouse warming has a modest effect on increasing westerly winds, but the bigger effect is ozone and ozone depletion. So since about 1980, we've been seeing the ozone hole each year around Antarctica deepen and become sort of maximized in about the year 2000 or 2005. That's when the ozone hole had the lowest amount of ozone. And it's fortunately likely to increase, recover somewhat now, but it's a slow recovery. And that has, ozone absorbs ultraviolet radiation, so it would warm the stratosphere. But when it's depleted, we see stratospheric cooling, which is what this picture shows in pressure and latitude. So a lot of stratospheric cooling occurring during the summer season, and it's really focused around Antarctica. And these kinds of temperature gradients occurring in the atmosphere drive circulation changes, and indeed it actually drives enhancement of the jet, and that is felt all the way down to the surface. This temperature doesn't show it, but you can take my word that when you create this kind of temperature change in this atmosphere, you expect westerly wind enhancement. So CO2 has a kind of similar but much weaker pattern, but the bottom line is they've been additive over the last 30, 40 years. And so just a cartoon, if we increase the westerly wind, this is an arrow coming out of the page at you. So imagine that arrow coming faster. I mentioned it caused northward currents, but there's an enhancement that's the greatest right under the jet and a little less large to the south, and so that divergence drives a suction. So it sucks more water up here, a little bit more down here. So we get in a little anomalous circulation right in this location where there was already upwelling. So there is an expectation of some increased upwelling. So sea ice, we think, will respond to this upwelling, but I think the more important part is that it has likely been felt by the ice shelves. So this warm water that always has been upwelling is likely upwelling a little bit more strongly, but also tilted a little bit more towards the continent and under the ice shelves, driving some ice basal melt. And then in turn, the story is that this extra meltwater that comes off is flooding the Southern Ocean, which actually traps this heat and makes it even more likely to hit the shelf and not the sea ice. So kind of complicated set of events, right? You might think this could also cause more sea ice loss, and it hasn't. So instead, we think the bigger effect has been that it's driving melt of the shelves, and the flooding of seawater has kind of made almost no effect to the sea ice. So just end with a simulation that I did. This is a very high resolution simulation. I wish I could always run simulations at this resolution. This is capturing some really beautiful dynamics. I just want to emphasize that we have very sophisticated models that simulate flow of ice, cracks and development of openings along the coast known as plenias. These are eddies that are forming in the ocean, and the sea ice is just caught in these eddies and swirls around. This model has a fully dynamic atmosphere and ocean and sea ice. I confess, though, when I did these experiments, we ran a much lower resolution. This is mainly for other work that I've done, but it makes for a beautiful animation. But when we look at actually how these Earth system models in detail treat the Antarctic, they're lacking in a big part, which is they don't have floating ice shelves at present. They haven't, they will in the future. People are really working hard to add them, but it turns out it's hard to add something that depresses the upper surface of the ocean. They just weren't designed for it. They were designed to have ocean bottom bathymetry, but not top bathymetry. But we're getting there. So models have a wall here, no shelf. So we wouldn't be able to simulate this dynamical melting yet, but we can just hypothesize that there's extra melting coming from what we see as this increased upwelling of warm water and add a little extra water. So we did that. And when we did, it does what you expect, which is it reduces the salinity. So this is latitude and depth, just showing the upper ocean dramatically. No surprise, we added fresh water. So it has no salinity, so it should reduce the salinity of the ocean. And that stabilizes the ocean. It also cooled the ocean. And that is the effect we were trying to find. So this is trapping more of the upwelling of water because of the ocean being more stable and trapping it at the height of the ice shelves. So a mechanism to accelerate the ice shelf melt that was the source of this hypothetical fresh water anyway. So does this cause the sea ice to expand like we had seen, or at least a lack of sea ice retreat? It depends on how much we freshen. So the rate at which we add the fresh water, we experimented. So without any fresh water, we see the sea ice declining in the Antarctic in our global climate model simulation. But when we add fresh water, it just depends on how much we add. If we add a pretty high scenario, we could definitely get the sea ice to expand because it cools the upper ocean. And there's a fair bit of uncertainty in how much fresh water we should add, but we think this is probably too much. And so I don't know quite what the right answer is, but I think this isn't outrageous, and it's within the bounds of what we think is possible from the ice shelf melt that we've observed. So the last hypothesis I want to address is whether the tropics have influenced the Southern Ocean. And this is a really active area of research, but it's a very important question because the tropics have very dramatic influence. I don't know how much El Nino influences you here, but where I live, El Nino has a pretty strong effect, and it can be, through waves in the atmosphere, transmit changes in the tropics to outside of the tropics. And indeed, we think that's occurred in the Antarctic. So we can do this by looking at what is climate changes in the tropics and examining how well they are related to our polar regions. This is obviously the Arctic, because I couldn't find a cute picture of the Antarctic, but we'll look in the Antarctic. And it's pretty well established that variability in the El Nino causes a deepening of the cyclone that occurs here in the Amundsen Sea. So the Amundsen Sea low is expected to deepen when we have, it deepens with La Nina and becomes more shallow with El Nino. And I showed that we had seen cooling in the eastern tropical Pacific over time, which is like a La Nina-like condition. So it's no surprise that over the last few decades, we also saw this deepening of the Amundsen Sea low in connection with the tropics, we think. And if you look at the sea ice pattern of change, it really mimics this warm air circulating more strongly from the north and cold air more strongly from the south, connecting with the sea ice. So we think that the tropics have played a role, but it's kind of a local scale in the Amundsen Sea, probably in contributing to some of the loss of ice shelf along the Amundsen Sea. So with that, I'll just end and say that we're facing a future that we have a lot of decisions to make, and the Paris Accord has kind of invited us to think about different scenarios. And Here's a recent paper where they looked in depth at two possible scenarios, low emissions and a high emissions. They're not exactly the same as the Paris Accord, because they started this work earlier. But you can see what their scenario is for the next 75 years, about 1 degree versus 3 degrees. So pretty dramatically different. What would those look like? Well, in terms of Antarctic's contribution to sea level rise, we're talking about 6 centimeters for this very low emissions, or about 27 centimeters over the next 75 years. So starting from just a decade ago, how much you'd expect by 2070. And temperature-wise, about a factor of 3 as well. So basically, it's basically trying to promote the idea that the more we can do to reduce our emissions, the more likely we could see a future where we have much more modest amounts of warming and more modest amounts of sea level rise. We do expect at some point the sea ice to start really significantly decreasing, but much less so in this mitigation scenario. I just want to say the Paris Accord currently, our intention, our pledges are to cause about 3.2 degrees Celsius. I want to emphasize this is relative to the pre-industrial, whereas that last slide was relative to 2005. So they're relative to two different time periods. So this is not as high as the high scenario in that past, because it's relative to pre-industrial. So it's somewhat of an improvement over a very high scenario where we do nothing, the so-called business as usual scenario. But this shows one other small issue, which is that even though we've made these pledges, this is what our current efforts are achieving. So this century, if we don't increase our efforts, we're looking at roughly a 3.5 degree warming relative to the pre-industrial. And currently we're about 1 degree above pre-industrial, so something like 2.5 degrees more. So on that note, what I've talked about today is that the Southern Ocean has warmed more slowly, and in fact, in some places it has experienced even cooling. And this is likely due to this buffering effect. The ocean is upwelling there, and so the upwelled water itself hasn't really started to warm. It was already a few tenths of a degree above freezing, and that has its own incredibly important influence on the Southern Ocean, but that temperature itself hasn't changed, we don't think. It has more of a buffering effect than anything. But then there are many contributions as to why. So this buffering idea would just say we should warm more slowly around Antarctica, but in fact we've seen this pattern of some very strong warming and some actual cooling. And that takes a lot more nuanced explanation than just simple upwelling. And I think it's really connected to the fact that we have westerly wind enhancement, and that westerly wind enhancement plays out in this kind of interesting way where it drives drift to the north and suction of warmer water upwards and more towards the continent, causing more shelf melt. And then we have seen that shelf melt, so it's consistent with this hypothesis. And then a freshwater flooding of the Southern Ocean that in turn kind of inhibits the warm water from actually reaching the highest elevation where the sea ice is. So the sea ice is kind of doing very little. And then lastly, we do think there's been tropical teleconnections that probably explain some of the local big changes in the Amundsen Sea and Ross Sea area. And it's pretty much anyone's guess what to expect for the tropics. We've, in the last few years, had a couple of El Niños, and so the cooling has kind of disappeared, but it's unclear whether it will come back. Climate scientists don't know whether the tropical Pacific climate changes are driven by greenhouse gases or natural variability at this point. Okay, that's it.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll now open it up to questions. If you have some questions.
Hi. So I might have missed this. Can you remind me why was there an increase in the ice
Yeah, well, I think, I'm going to tell you what I think, but it's not everyone in total agreement. I think it's the increased westerly wind which does drive current in the ocean to the north. So westerly wind enhancement should drive seawater that's cold to move northward and some sea ice to move northward as well. So that's a quick answer, but then there's the other side, which is the suctioning. So there's an offsetting effect from the suctioning of heat from below. So which one wins? And I think that's why you see at times this upward march, and then it's sort of failed at the end. Maybe the suctioning of heat has started to dominate. There's a lot more I could talk about. I guess the fact that we think there may be kind of a couple of different modes of variability in the Southern Ocean. I don't know if you have ever heard, there used to be a pretty good evidence of deep mixing occurring in the Weddell Sea, that we have a few snapshots from pre-1980 when satellites weren't very consistently measuring, and that hole in the sea ice is possibly evidence of deep mixing. And some of us think that we may be returning to that kind of local deep mixing in the Weddell Sea. So the Antarctic is a place of a lot of challenge for us scientists, because there's so much going on and the data don't help us in all cases. So we don't have enough data of the past to know for sure. That's my best guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I actually have two parts. The first part is in the northern and southern hemisphere, in addition to difference in land mass right at the poles, so the ice there, you also have vastly different amounts of land mass in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere. Often you see mentioned that ice melts and the ocean being dark absorbs more energy. But if we look at black body radiation during the winter months, the colder months, you have less sunshine, you don't absorb as much. You also emit radiation during the day. So the first part is between land, sea, and ice, what are the differences in emissivity overall?
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at is, does the northern hemisphere have drastically different circulation patterns because of more land?
Mm-hmm.
And the difference it absorbs and emits? And then the second part of the question after the differences in those between solar radiation and emission as opposed to atmospheric advection or oceanic advection. What are the figures that say how much of the temperature changes are due to circulation as opposed to solar radiation?
Circulation in the atmosphere or ocean?
Either, frankly.
Okay, I'll try. I'm going to try to repeat your question too, since I'm doing that for those who can't hear. So the first part was how does the proportion of land change, or if influence climate and climate change? And I guess you wrapped in emissivity. So ice is very good at emitting long-wave radiation. So that's the terrestrial radiation associated with its temperature. It's great at reflecting, but it also emits, but it's cold. So essentially, that's why it emits less than warmer objects. But it's good at it to the extent that something like, I guess, what's a poor emitter? Tim was telling me tinfoil actually is a very poor emitter. It's not a lot. It's not very intuitive what is and isn't. Metals are not as good at emitting radiation. So I guess the bottom line is that these are really small differences, the land versus ocean versus ice in emitting. And it's a kind of not a significant factor for causing just different climate change. But I think a much more important point is the higher reflectivity of ice and land compared to the ocean. Those are really big signals. We're talking, changing the amount of sunlight absorbed by a factor 10 over ice versus ocean. It's huge. So what you were talking about is more in the few percent level, not factors. So losing ice has this really big effect on short-wave radiation, not so much long wave. But The other factor is just the roughness of the planet. Like the planet has mountains and land that cause the winds to be slowed down in this northern hemisphere. That doesn't occur to the same extent in the southern hemisphere. So circulation is a really more dynamic in some sense, right? Winds are faster, and that drives more mixing and connections between the atmosphere and the ocean, in the southern ocean.
Are there any figures on the proportion of energy transferred due to advection as opposed to just solar radiation and reflected emissions?
Yes. So I guess you asked, are there differences? Do we have calculations about how heat is transported by the winds versus sunlight absorption? And definitely these kinds of models that we create, climate models, take these kinds of things into account. They have atmospheric winds that transport heat and moisture, and also they have sunlight and the solar variations. They even have sunspots, right? The sunspot cycle varies our insolation, our sunlight, a small amount, but these are tiny compared to the effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's pretty undebated among scientists, right? Yeah.
The bigger factor is atmospheric to oceanic transfer, or just changing in ice and radiation?
I don't think
Yes, what I'm looking at there.
it depends on the question, which one is bigger. Mm-hmm.
Got a couple of slides with projections of temperature change and how that affects sea level. Then you said, well, one set of numbers was relative to pre-industrial standard. So I was confused to take this thing to compare one of those slides with the other.
Mm-hmm.
Could you look at those again?
Sure. The Paris Accord tended to focus on climate change since pre-industrial. So the question was, can we review this because it was potentially too quick, right? And the Paris Accord really focused on how much climate has changed since the pre-industrial, and the goal is to have 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial. So we've already warmed 1 degree, so that's only a target of another half a degree of warming compared to where we are today. So just because this is a different study, they chose a different reference. It was started at a different time. And their reference was 2005, and asking how much we want to imagine for a future by 2070, so over about a 75-year period. And I wanted to show this because they focused on Antarctica and really give us a perspective of what you might see as a difference if you do mitigation, if you work hard at trying to avoid climate change. What does that buy you? Right? That's my goal for showing this slide. Because sometimes I think it helps to understand, what our choices are. If we don't make any action, what we face versus if we do. And that was also the nature of the recent 1.5 degrees Celsius report that was published last fall. But this was an earlier study, which...
Okay, we'll take one last question here.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's taken a fair amount of fancy scientific footwork, both to explain why Antarctic sea ice has been increasing for so long, and even a little bit more to explain why the last 3 years we've seen a different trend. How confident are you that this trend of the last 3 years is going to continue, and what gives you that confidence?
I have a paper, so what do we think about the last 3 years in terms of the next? And I think this is a huge question that I'm not confident I can answer at all. Because predicting the future is hard. First of all, can I predict what happened here? I argue that I think possibly the ocean has started to mix more deeply, and we saw that it did that in the 1970s. And there's a little instability that can occur in the Weddell Sea. There's a seamount that, the bathymetry is very high in one region that can promote this. I'm not entirely satisfied with that explanation. The other There's a long story here, right? Thing that happened in 2015 was a very, very big El Nino. Yeah. I think actually it might have been a few months prior, so it might have been the end of 2014. My memory for dates is poor. But there was a very big El Nino that precedes this. And normally, a big El Nino, say there was another one in 1998, I think you might associate that little change, a similar magnitude El Nino. So why was this El Nino causing such a big change this time? It could have been a number of factors that added up. So when this happened, I wrote a paper saying that I think this was primarily a result of a big El Nino, and I think it's going to go back up, and it didn't. So now I'm looking for more explanations, and I think the mixing is another hypothesis. But really, this is a mystery that needs further study. Yeah.
Okay. With that, let's thank Cecilia again. The next Frontiers of Science